I think that's great, Joey. Thank you so much. Stand up. Joey Clark is our, raise your hand if you're singing Joey's chorus here at Episcopal Homes. Some of the chorus are here.
Yeah.
And you've all heard us talk about how amazing he is. And you want to say anything about that music you just played?
Oh, I was trying to find stuff of the era of Kathleen's books, and so this is the hymnal that the Pilgrims brought over. So these are the like original hymns that they were singing in this time period. I couldn't believe. I mean, it was not that hard to find on Google. You just Google Pilgrim hymnal, and it comes right up. So yeah, this is, and it's all in vintage writing too. So it was fun to look at it and try to figure out what it all meant. But those were a bunch of psalms that you just heard.
Thank you so much. And of course, I thought of making all the men sit on this side and all the women on that side, but then I realized then all the men would have to be in front and all the women in back, and so we aren't going quite that far to put you back in the era. And we decided not to try to attempt to emulate the indigenous music of the time. The common mistake in our minds, especially here in the Midwest, that if you are one of the native nations, you're drumming. The Wampanoag did not drum. They clacked sticks. So every time that I go to some reenactment of Thanksgiving, you hear drumming, I'm thinking, you don't know nothing. But thank you so much for coming today. This is really a thrill to see all of you. Everyone could come except the book. You've heard about all these issues we have with everyone buying everything. Well, everyone's buying a lot of books, and that's using up the paper, and that's taking up the trucks. And my publisher told me Tuesday, Kathleen, we gave your manuscript to the printers before Thanksgiving, and they put it in the queue, but then they ran out of paper, and then they ran out of boxes. So essentially, the check is in the mail. So I'm sorry about that. I wanted to hold it and show you. And if you want a book, and I'm hoping that you will, I have information out in the hall. The easiest thing is if you just order it from Barnes & Noble. They have it listed out of stock, which is a very nice way of saying it hasn't come yet. But you can order from Barnes & Noble. You can also put your name down, and when the books come, which they tell me, yes, they will be here for sure next week, I'll get the book to you. So if you decide you want one. A couple of you said you want all of my books, so if you haven't read the first two and you want to order them, just put that down on the blank. So let's go right to the book. Tides of the Kennebec. This is a quote from William Bradford. Having procured a patent for Kennebec, they now erected a house up above in ye river, in ye most convenient place for trade, as they conceived, and furnished the same with commodities for ye end, and both winter and summer, not only with corn, but also with such other commodities as ye fishermen had traded with them, as coats, shirts, rugs, blankets, biscuit, peas, prunes, and what they could not have out of England, they bought of the fishing ships, and so carried on their business as well they could. And if you want to look at Bradford's book afterwards, you'll find that I was making sense out of some very strange spelling. Here's a quote that's also in the beginning of the book from Metacom, who was the sachem, the leader of the Wampanoag at the time that the people came from England. Here's what he wrote much later. The English who first came to this country were but a handful of people, forlorn, pure, poor, and distressed. My father relieved their distresses in the most kind and hospitable manner. He gave them land to plant and build upon. They flourished and increased. By various means, they got possessed of a great part of the territory. And by the way, they talked a lot about increasing, which meant growing in population, which back then was considered a good thing. But he still remained their friend till he died. And Metacom is talking about his father who we heard of as the Sachem, and Metacom was his son. My elder brother became Sachem. They pretended to suspect him of evil designs against them. He was seized and confined and thereby thrown into illness and died. Soon after I became Sachem, they disarmed all my people. Our lands were taken, but a small part of the dominion of my ancestors remains. I am determined not to live until I have no country. I made 6 trips back to Plymouth, Massachusetts when I was first researching the book. And if you've been to Fort Snelling and you see the living history there, the Pilgrim ancestors, descendants, excuse me, have a living history of Plymouth plantation. And back in the 1970s, the Wampanoag decided that they also wanted to have their own site. They were actually approached by the people in Plymouth, saying, the people in Plymouth said, well, do you want to go with us? And they said, are you kidding? After everything that's happened in our history, you think we want to be part of your anything? No, we don't. But they thought about that, and they came back with a counter proposal. They said, how about if we have Hopemoc's home site? Hopemoc was the first leader Sachem when the Wampanoag were with them. If we have Hopemoc's home site on our terms, first of all, although we will dress in the manner of the 1600s, we will be us today, because they're constantly going against the assumption that Native people are gone, that they're history. Whereas the Wampanoag are alive and well. They have their tribal headquarters off Nantucket and Gaze Head Island in Akina. And they didn't want people to look at them and say, oh, who did you used to be? This is who we are now. And that was on the premise on which they agreed to do Hopemoc's home site. And of course, they are in charge. And it's very interesting. Really, I couldn't have written the book without Hopemoc's home site. But my first time there, I didn't get very far. I'd say, well, what was your coming of age? Because my characters, for those of you who've read the first book, they're 13 when the books start. Coming of age is a huge thing. And I was told, we have a beautiful ceremony, but it's ours. And I had to respect that. So I asked one of my Dakota friends here in Minnesota, and he gave me very good advice. He said, Kathleen, don't say, tell me. Ask, what can you tell me? So I went back with that approach. And when I asked, what can you tell me about coming of age? I got this incredible story about when a young girl gets her first period. They cut her hair to the ears, and when it grows to her shoulders, she can get married. And I'd already written the draft of the book, and I called up my editor. Chapter 14, we've got to put this story in. It's just too amazing to leave out. And I'd already had Adhi Tosh have her menarche in October, and she was getting married in March. And I thought, how fast can her hair grow? And I thought, he gave me 3 hours of just incredible interview when we went back the next time. And in fact, my husband said, you just came floating down the trail. He said, I knew something good had happened. But in those 3 hours, I at least felt like I knew enough not to be deliberately disrespectful. But when you do a book of historical fiction, for me, that means 2 goals. One thing, to know enough about the history to bring the history alive. And there's a quote that I use in all my books from Julius saying, history is not just dates and events. It's a pain in the heart. And until we feel the pain in the heart, we don't know history and we repeat it. And I would add to that not only the pain, but the joy. So my goal is to make everything at least plausible that I use. And I kind of had a fight with my writers group for a while. They wanted something bigger to happen. And I said, there's enough big happening. I don't have to invent anything. So when you read my books, every significant event is historical. You can Google it, look it up, it's there. But this book takes us away from Massachusetts. And when I was talking to my granddaughter the other day, who is now old enough, she's 19, that she's read the books. We kind of kept them from them till they were old enough. She said, it's just freaky. And I said, what's freaky? And she said that this one ancestor, John Howland and Elizabeth Howland, would be at so many historically significant events. I said, I know. If I tricked it up, you'd accuse me of, false advertising or something. But John and Elizabeth Howland were on the Mayflower. They were there when things were happening. And the Pilgrims had gone up to Maine because they had trading rights with the Abenaki. So let me read a little bit part of after they got up to Maine. As soon as I find it in my iPad, one problem with not getting the book here. I'll take it out of here. I suppose I should say spoiler alert, but it's all in the history books anyway, so you'll know. This is seen from Elizabeth's point of view. She's talking with her friend Priscilla. You've all heard about Priscilla because Longfellow wrote about Priscilla and John Alden. Priscilla sighed heavily. You were just 13, a child really, that terrible first winter when we lost our parents and so many others. I am just enough older than thee to remember when our men were attacked by strangers. Priscilla rubbed her arms as if to shed a foul covering. Mayhap you did not understand how quickly trouble stirs up. Even if we can defend against poachers, the Abenaki savages here and thy Wampanoag friends could decide to join forces against us. I was at a loss for words. All these years, 14, since that dreadful first winter, and now my old friend was reliving that harrowing time. Of course I remember, I told Priscilla. She was my only woman friend of my own kind here at the trading post. I did not want to admonish her, nor did I want her fears to inflame the rest of our little settlement and lead to sending Atitash and Black Whale away. Not only did I like having Atitash near, we needed them to negotiate with the Abenaki. Priscilla's life had been upended years ago when her high status became lower than mine. And let me just say, as part of the research, Priscilla Mullins came over with a family with servants. And that just told me right away the Mullins had money. Half the people that came in the Mayflower were actually Puritans. The other half were paying passengers because the Pilgrims couldn't afford it. So Elizabeth Tilly was from a family that had no servants, so we knew that she didn't have money, but Priscilla Mullins did, so she'd been a higher status. She lost that status in the New World. When I first started writing, the more I learned about the Pilgrims, the more I realized, as you just heard in this passage, they believed that the native people were savages, and not only savages, but in their theology, God worked through the devil. God used the devil to punish people. And they believed that the devil had corrupted and owned the hearts and souls of native people. That's how deeply ingrained their distrust of native people were. And I knew I couldn't change, Elizabeth was, and there's no way I'm going to publish a book that perpetrated that attitude without a counterpart. So with great hesitancy, I started doing my research on Wampanoag and created a character based on the historical person Hopemok, who had many children, and so I created Atitash to be Hopemok's daughter. And so the book is written from both points of view. It's all first person from Atitash and first person from Elizabeth. We'll go back to hearing from Atitash. As I moved, the Kennebec River, by the way, is in Maine. Anyone here been to Kennebec? If Margot's here, I know Margot has. But we visited the Kennebec, my youngest daughter and I, and it kind of reminded me of the St. Croix. It's a big, wide river at the place. but it has a tidal surge. There are many little islands out on the Atlantic, but in the flow tide, the salt water comes up from the ocean. And the northern part of the Kennebec is fresh water rushing down, and where the surge trading occurred, because they would bring the beaver pelts, which was the main target. And by the way, they were after the beaver pelts in Maine, because for one thing, with the steel traps, they greatly reduced the beaver population in Massachusetts. So they're looking for fresh meat, literally fresh fur, but also in Maine, because of the cold, the pelts were thicker. So the trade rights that they had with the Abenaki, they would come down the river to where, what is presently day Augusta, Maine, where the surge comes up, and then they'd load them on the boats to go back in the ebb tide and go ship back over to England. So Atitash is there when some poachers had been actually financed by people in Boston to come up and steal in the Pilgrim's View. Now, no one seems to think about the fact that we're stealing all the beaver from the native people, but they had trading rights. So they went to this confluence of the Kennebec in a boat and put a cable down, and John Howland was in a boat there to protect their rights, and they cut the poacher's cable, and then the poachers shot. Someone in John Howland's boat was killed, and then someone in the poacher's boat was killed. That's history. Atitash says, as I arrived at the river, a shot exploded across the water. I saw a man in John Howland's canoe slump, and I hit the ground. My body burned with the memory of gunfire in my body, as fresh as the day I was shot. Another shot rang out. Peering through the bush, I saw a man in a bigger wind canoe fall back. Frantically, I looked for Blackwell and my brother who'd gone ahead. Would my man have taken the dugout canoe into the river? But there was no sign of a dark man with feathers in his topknot. So those are little samples, and now I'm happy to take questions. Mary?
How did you get started on all of this in the first place?
That's a good question, because like with everything in my life, it was an accident. My grandmother Osborne was a very kind, humble person. She had a picture on the wall in her bedroom that I stayed in when I visited her that showed a pilgrim woman with crossed arms gazing into the distance. And grandmother told me that was our ancestor Mary Chilton, who when the Mayflower went back to England, she was realizing all her ties with home were cut. So that picture stayed somewhere hidden in me. I didn't think about it. And then when my father died, and of course this is long after my grandmother died, I was going through his library, and I was surprised to find this book. It's written by a British man, Vernon Heaton, and it's The Mayflower. So I thought, oh, good, something by a Brit, which does make it interesting because you see from their point of view, it's a lot more about what was going on in England and why anyone would leave home and everyone to come. But I also found all these underlying names, which I discovered then were the people that we're descended from. And millions of us are Mayflower descendants. Some people think that makes us special. We all know it doesn't. But naturally they married each other. So if you're married to one person that was on the Mayflower, you're probably descended from 10 or 11, maybe 3 or 4 households. So I started looking up about them, and here were 2 girls, 13 years old in this book, that both came over with their parents. And after the Pilgrims arrived in Massachusetts, for those of you who read the first book, half of them died the first winter. 16 of the 20 married women died the first winter. None of the teenage girls did. And Mary Chilton and Elizabeth Tilley were 2 13-year-old girls who were orphaned that first winter. Well, that story of being orphaned in a new land stuck in my heart. 2 years later, when Elizabeth Tilley was 15, she married John Howland, a 30-year-old man. So as one of my high school girlfriends said, Kathleen, I was going to give your book to my daughter, but then you went and had her marry a 30-year-old man when she was 15. I said, if you want to change history, write a different book yourself. But that's what got me started. And it just never let go. I never planned to do that. It's just what it did. One of the things I learned in going to Massachusetts was, to my surprise, it was helpful to be there the same time as the school kids. The first time I thought, oh my gosh, I gotta come in the summer or something when all the tourists are here, because these little kids, they filled the room. I was a teacher, I love little kids, but seriously, But then I realized they asked questions I didn't dare ask. For example, I looked around and I kept thinking, where is the outhouse? Where's the latrine? And I knew they had chamber pots, which they actually called piss pots. But I thought, where's the latrine? And I thought, now how do I phrase this question? And then I was there with a group of third graders, and this little boy, trying to impress his schoolmates, he said to Lydia, someone who was playing this teenage character, where's your bathroom? And Lydia said, oh, when I want a bath, we heat the water and we pour it into the copper tub. Oh, do you mean where do we piss? And she said, well, in the muck heap. And I thought, of course. I'd seen what I thought of as the compost pile out there. And then she said, but my father just turns his back. So the little boy and his friends were giggling, and I thought, oh, now I know how to write it. Now I know how to write it. So, Christine?
From the other two books we checked out from our St. Paul Public.
They're in the library here, and they're also in the St. Paul Public Library. They're in the Merriam Park Library.
Which library?
I think where's Mac? Are they in the library in the terraces? I also have a couple copies I can loan people if you want them loaned. So, yeah, you can find them. Mary?
Hard to find the publisher.
Hard to find the publisher?
Hard to find the publisher.
Oh, that's interesting. Mary asked, how do I find a publisher? And at first I thought, I looked into getting an agent, and it looked like agony. It looked like waiting for someone to ask you for the high school prom or something, just, I don't want to do this. But I knew, I took classes at the Loft. Because first of all, I had to learn how to write. I was never a writer. Every term paper I ever got, even if I got an A, it said, not up to class discussion. And I was...
I think it burnt out.
It burned out. All right, is this mic working, Jim?
Well, it works, but not for them.
Oh, not for you. All right, tell me if you can't hear me. All right. So I told stories. I played with paper dolls. I made up stories for my sisters. I talked, obviously, but my writing was messy. Thank you. And so I just didn't like to write. And then when this story I planned when I retired, I thought, oh, maybe write funny stories about when I was in office, because those stories are usually either heroic or defaming, and I wanted to just write something fun. But before I could do that, Elizabeth and Aditash grabbed me. And so then I had to learn how to write. So I went to the Loft, and of course one of the things they try to tell you is how to get a publisher, and it's really hard. Meanwhile, I was a frequent flyer at Subtext Bookstore, which used to be right over here. And Sue there, one day I was in there, and she said, I just went to an event, kind of a happy hour for new publishers and new booksellers. And there was a guy there from this new press, and I asked him if he'd look at your book, and he said they would, so send him the manuscript. And by this time I'd learned the routine, you send 20 pages, and then if they like it, they tell you to send more. And so I sent 20 pages to a few dead ends, But I sent 20 to 40 Press, and Nick Damasus called me and said, let's get together for coffee. Meanwhile, I looked at self-publishing, because I thought, well, I'll spend my money there instead of retiring or whatever, And so I actually picked Beaver Pond, which was told the best of the self-publishing. And you could do it, I think it would have cost about $4,000. So something that I could figure out to waste my money on if I gave up my vacations or whatever, you know. And so Beaver Pond had an editor look at it, and she called me up. I love your project, but let's get rid of the history and just have the girls. And I thought, so when Nick Damascus wanted to talk to me, I thought, he's going to tell me get rid of the history. But we met over here at Nina's for 3 hours, and he had read all of my manuscript. He totally understood it. As I told you earlier, he explained to the other 2 guys in 40 Press. 40 Press is 3 men who went to Benilde St. Margaret together, and when they turned 40, said, let's do something fun. They all have day jobs. Nick's a librarian, Joe Riley is a publisher at Augsburg, and Kelly is an attorney. And Kelly had published a murder mystery with them. So Nick and I met and talked for 3 hours, and I became convinced he did understand my book. He is an incredible managing editor. So when someone at one of the bookstores recently said to me, well, Kathleen, you should go with one of the big publishers now. I said, you know, I'm 83, I'm not into being a bestseller. I don't want to do book tours, and I don't want to give up Nick Damascus, my managing editor, because he really knows what to take out, what to leave in. He never tells me, say this. He says, what about trying a dream here? And I try a dream. There are a lot of dreams in the books. And so he gives me questions and prompts. He doesn't give me words. So that's someone I like to work with. But it's definitely a challenge, and I'm so glad I found 40 Press, because for me, that just made it workable. You know. Christine?
Is it local?
Is it local? 40 Press is local, yes. Yeah, they're right here in the cities. But their publisher isn't. Actually, I mean their printer. Their printer is across state lines in Wisconsin or somewhere. Charlotte.
How was it different? This is your third. Like what?
This is my daughter, by the way. I mean.
This is a soft blob. But I'm actually curious about this, having lived with her as she's created these characters. So what changed in the writing of the third book compared to the first and the second? What have you learned about yourself as a writer, or about the process of writing?
Well, one thing that I've learned is stop planning on anything happening when you want it to happen. Today's evidence of that. Another thing I learned is how connected I am to these characters. After the second book, I thought, well, been there, done that, do something else now, you know, and I sold my house, as you know, moved in here, all these other changes. I thought, I don't need to write anymore, but I did. You know, I'm just attached to them. And Fran, sitting here, is one of the people here that inspired me to write more, because after reading my first 2 books, Fran said, when are you going to do another one? I like my people, or something. So thank you, Fran. But when people get attached to the characters, some people that read it, I think this is Barbara, and might have been you, Barbara Dennis here. This is wonderful to move in here and have a whole new audience. You know, that's another thing that made it really different. I think it was Barbara that read it around Thanksgiving time and then watched a video, a movie about the Pilgrims. And she said, I learned history too. I didn't even think about it while I was reading the book. And I like that, because I want you to get connected to the history, but I don't want, there's plenty of history books. There's hundreds of history books about the Pilgrims. But to get attached to them, you know, to get that feeling, that's better. That's better. Diane?
So how long did it take you to start and finish your third book compared to at the beginning of the first
If you couldn't hear Diane's questions, how long did this book take compared to the first one? It took me 7 years for the first one, partly to do all that research and partly to learn how to write. And I thought I must be wasting a lot of time, but I learned later through the loft. The average first book takes 7 years. And then the second one I wrote just 3 years later. But that was during the time that my husband died. And he read the last version of it, and then he passed, and then the book came out. And I couldn't write for about 6-8 months after that. But when I could write again, I thought, oh, it's so good to be back with these people again, you know, in the other world. You know, even today, even though they were facing horrific every day, with everything that goes on here, it still lifts my shoulders to get back into the 17th century and see what they endured and how they persevered and how they, by the way, if I didn't mention it, the Wampanoag are matrilineal and matriarchal. And that was much more surprising than I thought it would be. I thought being a strong feminist, blah, 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 having broken some barriers myself. For those of you who don't know, I was elected to the legislature in 1980. There were 120 in the House, and I was one of 22 women at that time. So I kind of lived the 20th century version, or 21st century version of barriers. But I had no idea how many things would change with matrilineal and matriarchal. For example, no matter what we say here, no matter what we name the kids, there's always, it's probably going to be their father's name and all of that, which is the way it works. But with the Wampanoag, they rejoiced when it was when the child was female, because the child is always the mother's clan. And the other interesting thing about Wampanoag family structure, which is probably true of most matriarchal, matrilineal, Dad is kind of like our non-custodial dads, breezes in and takes them to the circus, you know, and plays with them. But the mother's brother is the clan uncle, and he is responsible for the child's upbringing. If the kid doesn't turn out, it's not Dad's fault, it's the uncle's fault. You know? So when a girl is born, she's the mother's clan, everything is cool. When a boy is born, then you get all these extra, more complications. And I hadn't thought about that before I started writing it. They told me early on at the loft, you know, we were thinking, well, I should do more research. And they said, start writing now, because you don't know what research you need until you start writing. And be prepared to throw it out. And I thought, what? I had no clue about editing. I don't think I ever edited a term paper. I finished them at 10 and went to bed and turned them in. You know? But you know, my teachers at the loft said, writing the first draft is like practicing scales. You know, you're not gonna. And in fact, when I went and heard some famous writer talk that I really liked, David McCullough, someone asked you, well, when do you write? How much do you write? And he said, that's the wrong question. It's when do you think and when do you edit? And his daily routine, I mean, he's an incredible writer. He writes in the morning. He has lunch, takes a nap, takes a walk, and then he said, I make sense of what I wrote in the morning. And to me, it was like, you're not a good writer if you don't write it the first time. And I totally had to throw that out the window. And I'm in a writer's group now that I've been in for 15 years, and we edit each other's work. And now it's sort of changed how I read. I mean, even when I read a really favorite author, I find myself wanting to change something. Mary Jo.
When I read the first two books, I was surprised at my own appreciation of the complexity of the Native groups and the different roles that they played in the story. Some friendly, some not. The whole relationship between those groups, in addition to what's going on with the
Right.
and I felt that showed my limitations in understanding what happened.
Right.
And I appreciated reading and having that happen for me. So thank you.
Thank you. That's good insight, because as Mary Jo said, we tend to see people, different people, as one. And although we may know by now there were multiple nations and multiple tribes. And just like sometimes here, we're all Episcopal homes, we're all pretty much look the same, but oh, are we from Terraces, or are we from Cornelia House, or are we from St. Paul or Minneapolis, Wisconsin, or Minnesota? I grew up in western Nebraska originally, and there were quite a few Lakota people back there. In fact, my grandfather learned Lakota when he was young. So that was my first exposure, was to Lakota people. And then we moved to eastern South Dakota. And my late husband was from a reservation in Sisseton. He was typical of the white townies. He went to school with Dakota kids. In fact, our next door neighbor on Goodrich Avenue had gone to high school with Jim Bellinga in Sisseton. So, but it wasn't until I was director of a children's collaborative here and working with the local people, the local indigenous people, to establish a Native American Family Center, that I think I finally gained the trust of Native people enough that I could be frank with them, and they were basically the ones that advised me on this work, because I knew they would be honest with me. And it was a man that I met from the American Indian Family Center that he was the one that gave me the advice, ask, what can you tell me? So the Dakota people say, or the Lakota people where I grew up say of the Dakota people, they just can't say their L's, you know. Well, we have a few treats. I hope they're still out there. Even though I couldn't bring you books, I thought I can at least bring you some treats, and a place to sign up if you want me to give you a book, or where to sign up if you want Barnes & Noble. So thank you all for coming.